Rasha Christi South Africa, and welcome to our Thursday evening interviews. And I'm glad that you could join us, all of those watching on YouTube and listening in. My name is Simon Brace. I'm with Rasha Christi South Africa and lead the Rasha Christi chapter at Northwest University. We are a campus ministry, an organization that exists to serve students on campus, students and Christian students on campus, and professors, to help them better understand the reasons for the Christian faith, to not just know what they believe, but why they believe it, and also to help Christians be better equipped for conversations specifically about the gospel, to deal with the objections that come, and to help us become more persuasive in our efforts to share the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ. We have a Rasha Christi website in South Africa. Take a look, if you don't mind, at rashachristi.co.za. We have a number of resources there that are free and available to you all. And we also have a YouTube channel, which we are slowly building up a library of interviews with Christian scholars from all over the world. And do feel free to join us and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And be a part of that as well. As a Christian student organization, we're also looking for support. So if you feel led to support us, we will definitely thank you for those considerations as well. So welcome to Rasha Christi. By the way, for those students out there at other universities in South Africa, if you're interested in starting a Rasha Christi chapter on a campus where there's no Rasha Christi chapter, do get in touch with us. We have chapters at Stellenbosch, Rhodes, University of the Northwest, UKZN, Maritzburg campus, and also University of Pretoria. This evening, it's my privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Mark Allen. He's coming to us from Texas in the United States. I've known Mark for many years. He's a good friend, and he had the misfortune of having to study with me in seminary when we were in North Carolina. Mark is married to Courtney, and they have a daughter. And Mark is now a professor teaching at SMU University in Texas, and he finished his PhD, it was last year, as I believe. And he's going to be our guest speaker this evening, and we're here to deal with Christianity and the arts. So for those listening in, it's important because the lecture that Mark is going to give to us this evening comes off the back of last week's session here for Rasha Christi, where we took the time to watch a documentary put together by Roger Scruton on why beauty matters. This documentary was done by the BBC a number of years ago. And if you hunt around on YouTube and on the internet, you can find many places where it has been kept. And often there's a transcript because it's been translated into a number of languages. So if you hunt around, you can find the documentary on the BBC. It's about an hour long, and listen to it, because much of what we're going to discuss this evening is tied to Roger Scruton's discussion on beauty and why it matters. What I would like to do was to just turn off my phone here, this speaker, the sound there. But yeah, so that's what we're up to this evening. Mark, good evening, and welcome to Rasha Christi South Africa.
Good evening. It's good to be here, Simon.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to spend this evening with us. Well, it's evening for us. I know it's afternoon for you. And we look forward to the lecture. Basically, format is you're going to do your presentation for us, and after which we'll then do some Q&A with you. Those who are online watching on YouTube, feel free to post your questions in the comments box. Those will then be picked up by our tech guy, and he will send them across to me, and hopefully we'll be able to do some Q&A with Mark at the end of his lecture then. But Mark, if you want to take it over from then, it's over to you now.
All right, sounds good. Let me share my screen. All right. You able to see that there?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with you tonight. Simon is a good friend of mine, and I hope Rasha Christi South Africa understands the treasure that you guys have in Simon and Nell and their family. But without further ado, I'll get on to this. So tonight we're talking about meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty in art, and specifically modern art. And we're kind of asking the question, are these concepts dead or alive? This painting that I'm kind of starting out with here It's by an Italian painter named Pompeo Battoni, and it's called "Time Orders Old Age to Destroy Beauty." So, time is the old man with the wings, the old woman is old age, and then the young woman is beauty. And so you'll see why this is kind of relevant to what we're talking about today, that over time it seems beauty has come under attack. It's obviously the focus of Roger Scruton's documentary, and so we'll talk quite a bit about this tonight. So as Simon mentioned, you guys are coming off of watching Why Beauty Matters, and so this is a documentary that actually came out right before I came to North Carolina to study with Simon at Southern Evangelical, and it was a very influential documentary. He has so many good things to say, but we're gonna, just like everything, we're gonna look at it critically tonight, as we should look at everything. And so our goals for tonight will be, there will be several. In general, we're gonna kind of talk about what does Scruton get right, and this is primarily related to his documentary. Scruton is a prolific author, and so there's no way I can talk about everything he's written and said, but we're going to primarily concentrate on his documentary Why Beauty Matters, since that's what you guys have watched recently. And then we're going to also talk about, and again, in general, what he or we can do better, kind of based on maybe some weaknesses in the documentary. What that's going to require us to do is I'll give a brief overview, and this is kind of tricky with a question as big as what is art. This is a perennial question that's gone on for thousands of years, but we're going to at least give a little bit of an overview on this. We'll have to do a little bit of art history. Primarily, I'm going to challenge what I call the Triumphalist Narrative, and I'll give some explanation for that here soon. As the title suggests, we'll talk about meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty, kind of where things stand with each one of those, kind of when we're looking at the landscape of the art world. Specifically, craftsmanship and beauty, they kind of come together as a package deal, and we'll talk about this issue of accessibility. And then we'll also talk about meaning, and specifically art as a form of philosophy, and vice versa, philosophy sometimes showing up as a form of art. And then at the end, we'll kind of bring all this together and make some parallels to truth, goodness, and beauty, to God, to Christianity, and those sorts of things. So yeah, what is art? Some kind of very, very basic definitions or understandings: the products of human creativity, something created for aesthetic expression, communication, or contemplation, something created that requires highly developed techniques or skills, and then something produced or intended primarily for beauty rather than utility. Again, these are very, very simple, kind of common dictionary level kind of what is art, but every single one of these is it doesn't take long to come up with a counter example for each one of these, and we're going to look at a lot of art tonight, so you'll see that really quickly. This is a list that I had my grad students come up with when I asked them, like, what is art? And it actually goes even longer than this. But as you can see, art is this multifaceted kind of enterprise, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. You can see that, there's some of the usual suspects on here, that beauty is obviously going to be on this list somewhere. But when you're thinking about artists, you're also thinking about skill and craftsmanship. There's also a strangeness to artists. They have this kind of creative ability to bring things to life. Vision, these are all some of the things that we might think of when we think about art. But the whole point is that it's really difficult to boil down to a succinct list of necessary and sufficient conditions what art is. But there have been people who have tried. And again, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but these are just a few, just to kind of give a taste for different things. This is Gerald Phalen. He defined art this way, at least in a restricted sense: the right way of making beautiful things for the sake of their beauty. Okay. Now, a couple things to pay attention to here. The right way of making, all right? So he's got craftsmanship embedded in there, and then he's also got for the sake of their beauty. And this is important because obviously this is about beauty, but he's kind of importing this art for art's sake language that maybe you've heard if you've ever taken an art history class. That, and then Scruton also talks about this when he talks about the utility of beauty, like what's the use of art, what's the use of love, what's the use of beauty. These are things that we pursue for their own sake. And so this is kind of where Phalen is coming from. But even though I highly recommend reading as much Phalen as you can get your hands on, there's this little definition here kind of falls short, because you think of, this is just one example. This is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. And you think of, okay, well, yeah, I could definitely say that the craftsmanship is there. It takes a certain amount of craftsmanship to pull something like this off. But for the sake of beauty, is that really what's going on here? So how does a work like this measure up against Phalen's definition of art? Well, it seems inconclusive at best. Then we've got Victonstein. Okay, so and again, these are just a few kind of cherry-picked people out, but there's several things that Wittgenstein is known for. But one of the things he's really known for, at least in this area, is this issue of language games. And what he discusses here on this topic is that there are certain concepts out there that, even though there's wide understanding of what these things are, when you actually look at them, they don't share a common link or common trait. And so he actually refers to games themselves. And these are just some little images of just a few different types of games. And if you actually try to pin down what is there a common thread between, American football and video games and solitaire and Ring Around the Rosie, it's a lot harder than you might think it would be to come up with a single trait that they all have in common. Well, you might say, well, it's about competition. Well, what about solitaire? Where you're playing a game by yourself. Well, it involves, physical activity. Well, what about, again, solitaire or video games? Competition. Well, what about Ring Around the Rosie? Nobody's really winning that game. So this is just, again, a real brief example of how a game is a lot harder to pinpoint than you think. And so Wittgenstein addresses this phenomenon by another analogy called family resemblance. And all right, so one of the big things that Wittgenstein is known for is this theory of language games. And the essential idea here is that there's a number of different concepts that, even though generally understood by everybody what they are, you know it when you see it, when you actually begin to dissect it and think hard about it, it's really hard to find a single trait that they all have in common. And so here, the example is actual games themselves. So if you look at little children's games or sports or video games or card games, it's really hard to pin down something that they all have in common. You could say, well, it's about competition, but well, Ring Around the Rosie is, kids' games sometimes don't have a clear winner. They're just playing a game. Whereas football or soccer, there's an actual winner. You could say physical activity. But again, solitaire or video games, is it fun? Well, sometimes it's fun, but then you have games like solitaire, where it's really, or chess, where it's not really about fun, it's about strategy. So Wittgenstein explains this phenomenon by what he calls family resemblance. Now, this is a photoshopped family portrait. And as you can see here, every single member of the family looks exactly the same. And if your family tree brought you to this place, well, there's probably some kind of problem at some point. Most of the time, family portraits or a family reunion doesn't look like this. It looks more like my family did. And this is an old photo from when my first trip to see my aunt in California. And you can see that me and my brothers are a little upset about the way my mom dressed us in all of our kind of surfer outfits. But if you look really hard, you will be able to see some similarities, especially between me and my brothers. But you even might be able to find some similarities between me and my mom, me and my dad, but it's a mix. All three of me and my brothers we're not twins, we're not identical twins, but we came from the same parents, so we share certain attributes from my mom and certain attributes from my dad, but it's kind of all over the map. Well, Wittgenstein thinks this is kind of how certain concepts work, how family resemblance works. He uses a lot of analogies. It's kind of like a rope. For instance, a rope like this has millions of different little fibers, and none of them run the entire length of the rope, but because there's enough overlap between them, they kind of cohere together in a single rope. Another way he describes them is cluster concepts. So you have all of these different variations, different media, sculpture, painting, music, and then again, there's beautiful, there's craftsmanship, there's all these, and they're all over the map. But the thing that you give up with this, there's some explanatory power here, that you do have certain outliers and then certain things that kind of group up in clusters. But the thing that you sacrifice with Wittgenstein's approaches is that art has no essential nature. And that might just sound like a bunch of philosophy mumbo jumbo. But what that means is essentially that art cannot really be defined, and that that there's really, at the end of the day, the most important thing is that there's no difference between works of art and ordinary objects. It's just, again, quote unquote, art. These are art. These are things that we call art, and these are things that we don't call art. It's not that they are or they aren't, it's just what we call them. And then along comes Arthur Danto, and this is the thinker that I've spent the majority of my time thinking and writing about over the past few years. He was a professor at Columbia University in New York, and he was working in New York at the height of kind of the abstract expressionist movement, when Pollock and Rothko and Andy Warhol were kind of in their heyday. But he basically says that, when you're looking at art history all the way up to the 19th century, everything has kind of been the same. But when you get to the 20th century, it kind of explodes, it splinters into a history of discontinuities. And so it's, again, kind of like what Wittgenstein says, it's really hard to pinpoint what makes art art. But Danto is not an anti-essentialist. He thinks there is a nature to art. And so he begins sifting through a lot of the commonly held characteristics of art, namely beauty, craftsmanship, and representation. And again, what I mean by representation is when you see the vase of flowers and you've got your pen and paper and you draw the vase of flowers, it's good or it's not good based on, does it represent the thing that you're drawing in a lifelike way? But ultimately, Danto discards all of those traditional characteristics and coins a new term called embodied meaning. And it's really focused on meaning, and the embodiment part is just kind of an inconsequential, kind of necessary thing. It's got to be embodied somehow. But really, meaning is where it's at for Danto. As I kind of mentioned, it's Warhol's Brillo boxes that kind of gave Danto this epiphany. He's at the original gallery opening in 1964 in New York, and he's looking at these Brillo boxes, these Brillo pieces that you see right now, and he's thinking, how is it that this looks exactly like a regular cardboard Brillo box, but they don't really differ visually according to sense perception, but one's a work of art and one isn't. What is it that makes it that way? And so he sees this as a challenge to Wittgenstein's view, because again, Wittgenstein only has sense perception to kind of tell the difference between them. There are no essences. So the question becomes, if Warhol's sculptures can't be distinguished visually from common cardboard Brillo boxes, what is it that sets them apart as works of art? Well, again, Danto is going to say meaning, but there's a big red asterisk here because we're going to challenge that here in a little bit. There's a glaring counterexample to this. One of the other problems with Danto's view, again, there's a lot good that that Danto has to say, but one of the kind of negative things that you have to swallow if you take his approach, because you can't sense or hear or see or touch, the meaning. How do you know the difference? Well, the art world has to tell us that there's a difference. In other words, collectors, curators, artists, people in that stratum of society, they're the experts. They're the ones who ultimately, in the art establishment, in the art institutions, they're the ones who tell us what is and is not art. And so that gives us some problems with Danto's approach. Number one, as we just mentioned, there's a circular problem. The institution tells us it's art because it's art. Okay, so you're in this vicious circle. Danto's approach to art also doesn't account for things called examples of art that are quote unquote beneath meaning. For example, artwork that is just beautiful or well made, but it doesn't need to be interpreted. It doesn't have a meaning. Okay, kind of eye candy or ear candy, if you will. And then again, there are these glaring counterexamples, and the biggest counterexample is that the original cardboard version of a Brillo box that he's mimicking is embodied. Okay, so it's embodied in cardboard, but it also has meaning. The graphic designer who originally designed that box designed it to show, zing, pow, cleanliness. It's in American red, white, and blue. So there is meaning there. And so when somebody brings this to Danto's attention, he just, quite frankly, kind of ignores this counterexample and keeps going. Speaking of keeping going, that's what we're going to have to do. We can't get too far into the weeds with Danto. Back to Scruton. But maybe what is art is not always the best question to ask. So Scruton actually gives an interesting parallel with jokes, of all things. Okay, he says that a joke is something that's meant to be laughed at. But if a joke fails to perform its function, we call it a joke that fell flat. Okay. In other words, we don't say that a joke that's not funny isn't a joke anymore. We just say, no, that's a bad joke. It's still a joke. It's just a bad joke. So a joke can perform its function in other ways too. It can be tasteful. It can be offensive. And when it's offensive, we just say it's in bad taste. So Scruton, at least with this argument, seems to avoid some of those problems of the question of what is art. Is it art or is it not? Well, so maybe it's a question of good art versus bad art. But this has problems also, because if you think about it, it seems like there's a point at which art becomes so bad or so thin, what I mean by thin, like kind of thinly construed, that it's not even worthy to be called art. An example here is, medicine, and then experimental medicine, then alternative medicine. The further you keep going down that chain, you eventually get to witch doctoring or kind of magic. So I'm not saying that there isn't a spectrum, but at some point we get to a place where is it really worthy to be called art? And some quick examples that I could point to here. This is a portrait by Picasso. These are kind of white paintings, if you will. This is by Cy Twombly, Kazimir Malevich, Rauschenberg's white paintings. And again, if you can't really see what's going on there, these are just white panels painted with white house paint, actually. And then you get to this last thing. This is by Yves Klein. This was actually an empty room. It didn't have anything in it. And we'll actually see more works like this. And so at what point do we say that art is no longer represented here? Even to the point where there's just meaning, no physical object. Tolstoy once said, art in our society has become so perverted that not only has bad art come to be considered good, but even the very perception of what art really is has been lost. In order to be able to speak about the art of our society, it is therefore, first of all, necessary to distinguish art from counterfeit art. So Leo Tolstoy is kind of playing with both themes here. Like he's is it good art or bad art? Yeah, well, that's an important question. But at the end, he also says, well, maybe there's a difference between real art, substantial art, and counterfeit art. So we didn't settle anything there, but I'm hoping I've at least painted a kind of a broader picture for you of kind of where things stand. Let's do a little bit of art history. I mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about this thing called a triumphalist narrative. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically means that when you look all the way back to antiquity, all the way up to the 19th century, you basically have four main qualities or values: meaning, craftsmanship, beauty, and representation. Representation, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit. Other terms that you'll see for this: mimesis, imitation, lifelike representation, visual similitude. There's some type of grounding in the world around us. But again, the triumphalist narrative really starts to take off here. So you get into the late 1820s and photography is born. The photo that you're looking at right now, this is widely thought to be the very first photograph, photograph, 1826. You can barely see, it's kind of an image outside of a person's window. These were printed on metal plates with chemicals. But within about a 10-year span, photography has grown quite a bit. And now you can actually see, well, that is a street in Paris. And you can actually see, this is the very first picture of a person. There's actually a person down on the street walking. And so by the time you get to the late 1830s, a lot of artists are talking about that this is the death of painting, because they also equated art with representation. At least they, in a simplistic way, they did. And so representation has a big target put on it and eventually kind of goes away. It's kind of removed from the list of important qualities. But craftsmanship also became a target because of photography, at least according to the triumphalist narrative. Danto writes that everything seemed to make painting and art was subtracted. For manual skill, you needed nothing more than the ability to push a button or squeeze a bulb. That meant that the hand was as pictographically irrelevant as the foot. And all that was needed now was to make the eye irrelevant. So again, I'm going to take exception to his kind of gloss on how easy photography is. Again, I think there's a difference between the photography that you and I do on our phone and then the real work of an Ansel Adams or somebody like that. But the point is that it's easier to take a photograph than it is maybe to paint a painting. So craftsmanship also kind of drops from the list. Enter Marcel Duchamp. Okay, this is maybe not a household name like a Michelangelo or Picasso, but Marcel Duchamp is a very, very important figure within art, primarily because of his ready-mades. In case you don't know what the ready-mades are, these are found objects. He didn't make these things. That's a wine rack, a bottle rack, a snow shovel, and a urinal. And he found these things or purchased these things and then just signed his name to them and called them ready-mades. And so this is what he's known for. The one of the urinal, he called this one Fountain. It was done in 1917. You're looking at the only known photograph of this work. And we don't know where the original piece is because more than likely it was thrown out with the trash, which was a very common fate for all of Duchamp's ready-mades. He once said that this is the single most important idea to come out of his work, his ready-mades, that is. And in 2014, the Fountain was named the single most influential artwork of the 20th century. Again, you might not believe that, but this is a group of, again, art world experts who judged it to be so. Now, there were several people who tried to defend the Fountain's beauty. Calvin Tompkins is one of his primary biographers. He says here, it does not take much stretching of the imagination to see in the upside down urinal's gently flowing curves the veiled head of a classic Renaissance Madonna, or a seated Buddha, or perhaps more to the point, one of Brancusi's polished erotic forms. Okay, but if you actually listen to what Duchamp said, he mocked people who said that his ready-mades were examples of beauty, especially the fountain. He said, I threw the urinal into their faces, and now they come and admire it for its beauty. It's the worst compliment they could give me. So here we see beauty becomes, it's targeted on the list. As a side note, again, I'm not going to be able to get too much into this today, but Duchamp repeatedly, even explicitly, claims that he never intended the ready-mades to be seen as art. But because the fountain is the fulcrum and the linchpin on which all of the triumphalistic narrative kind of hinges, it's ferociously defended to be art, even though Duchamp himself denies that it is. And we can talk about this maybe in the Q&A, but I actually argue that the fountain is really more of a philosophical statement about art, the nature of art. It's a philosophical artifact, and a very interesting one if you look at it as a piece of philosophy and not as a piece of art. So what is the triumphalist narrative? It is that modern art has triumphed over traditional art because craftsmanship, beauty, and representation have completely kind of been vanquished. But you should also know that beauty has a special target put on it. This is a quote from Barnett Newman, who was a renowned abstract expressionist and philosopher of art. He said, the impulse of modern art is the desire to destroy beauty. Okay, so you don't see that about representation and craftsmanship, but you do see that kind of vitriolic kind of language about beauty. Hans Urs von Balthasar also said, we no longer dare to believe in beauty, and we make of it a mere appearance in order that we may more easily dispose of it. This is important and will become important later because this is something that Danto kind of trips Danto up, because one of the reasons he gets rid of beauty is because he sees it as mere cosmetics. It's more mere surface. It's mere aesthetic. But we'll talk more about that later. So a few ways to challenge the triumphalist narrative. Did modern art really defeat traditional forms of art? Or is it still, are these traditional forms of art still around? Are they still important? Were they really vanquished from the whole world of modern art? Or maybe we should ask, in what ways is the triumphalist narrative true or false? In other words, in what circles? Maybe there's certain ways or certain places in certain circles that this is true, but not necessarily universally true. And again, why is there such a special rejection of beauty in the art world? Why is there so much hate, it seems, for beauty? A few other terms I want to talk about. What do I mean by meaning? Well, again, in generally construed here, I'm talking about anything like truth, concept, message, the expression of it, what's it about, the statement that it's trying to make, the content of a work of art. So when you hear me saying meaning, that's kind of what I mean there. So this gets us back to our timeline here. And so since meaning is an immaterial reality, okay, so meaning is this thing in the mind, it's this thing out there. What that means is the art world starts down this path towards dematerialization, again, to away from material things, embodied things. So that's where you get into things like black paintings and white paintings and blue paintings and color-filled paintings and zip paintings. That's what all these are. And that's Kazimir Malevich, Robert Rauschenberg, Yves Klein, Mark Rothko, and Barnett Newman. Okay, and those were all very prolific artists. These are just some pieces that I picked out. But this also appeals to the expressionists like Pollock, who's doing his drip paintings, or de Kooning, who's kind of scratching all over the surface in these kind of very, very abstract, non-representational ways. Yves Klein, this painting was made by painting naked women and having them kind of flop around on the ground on top of a canvas. This is Cy Twombly, who's scribbling across a canvas in a white pencil. And this is Rauschenberg again, who actually took one of de Kooning's drawings, asked for de Kooning to send one of his drawings to him, and then he erased it and called it Erased de Kooning. So anything that did make it a work of art is now gone, but that's, according to Rauschenberg, what makes it art. As a little side note here, there's another connection between Rauschenberg and Twombly. This is a picture I took of my little girl when she was 9 months old. I was in London teaching a class there with my wife, and we were going through the Tate Gallery, which is the big modern art museum there, and I snapped this picture and I posted it to social media, and my little comment on there was, my daughter wins first place in her very first exhibition. And it was supposed to be just tongue-in-cheek, kind of a joke. But my mother actually commented, "Congratulations, I didn't even know that she was exhibiting her work. That's so great." And I found it was really kind of cute and kind of funny that my mom didn't understand what was going, that this was very sarcastic. But on the other hand, there's this really kind of serious side that my mom did not realize that she was looking at millions of dollars worth of paintings on the wall, or drawings on the wall, that they weren't done by my 9-month-old at the time. And again, another little side note in this is Twombly was one of Robert Rauschenberg's assistants with his white painting series, where after Robert Rauschenberg originally painted them white, when they would go around to all the different exhibitions, well, they would get dinged up and scuffed up, and Cy Twombly was one of his assistants, and so he would just repaint them with a big white roller with house paint. Okay. So the process of dematerialization keeps going. I'm not going to play this entire thing for you, but this is a performance of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. I'll let this sink in for just a few moments, but this is a full symphony orchestra that's about to perform this work. Now, you may not realize, you might be wondering, when are they going to start? But what you don't realize is they've already started. This is the work by John Cage. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of pure silence. It keeps getting better. This is a group run by Brainerd and Delia Carey, who, this is Mr. Franco here. You might have seen him in a movie or two. They all work together with this a movement called imaginary art. I'm just going to play just a couple minutes of this for you.
Hello, I'm Brainerd Carey.
Hi, I'm James Franco.
Hi, I'm Delia Carey.
And one of my artworks is on display here, as you can see.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Non-Visible Museum today. It's a museum of ideas. It's a museum of real visual ideas that exist because we describe them and we are selling them and you're owning them.
It's a short film that is based on a story by William Faulkner. It's not one of his better known stories. It's called Red Leaves.
10-foot tall, gigantic, oval shaped sculpture.
And this was a great story full of action. It takes place in his fictional Yoknapatawpha County.
It's golden and is wrapped in an iridescent
foil. So just in
foil.
case you missed what's going on there, these are imaginary artists. They're real artists, but what makes them imaginary artists is the work that they have quote unquote created. It only exists in their imagination, and they're describing it. They were actually selling these works, and when you bought one, they would mail you a little card with instructions that you could put up on the wall, or your blank wall in your apartment or your house, and you could describe the work to your friends. And one woman actually paid $10,000 for one of these non-visible works of art. Robert Barry, in the same way, he wanted to do a big new exhibition, and so he sent out invitations on a white sheet of paper with the following text on it: "During the exhibition, the gallery will be closed." And so this was an exhibition that was on display, quote quote, in 3 different locations around the world. But again, just so you don't miss what's going on here, there was no exhibition. There was no material artifact. The empty galleries were actually completely inaccessible and there was nothing inside of them. But Herbert Vogel, who is one of the biggest conceptual art collectors of the last century, this is what he said of this. We have without a doubt the greatest piece of conceptual art that was ever done in the world. And if that weren't enough, several years later, they re-exhibited this work. Again, there is no piece, there's no material object, but they re-exhibited it in New York City under the name Closed Gallery Redux. All right, so the process of dematerialization also manifests in another way in what I call art as philosophy, okay? This is a work called 3-in-1 Chairs. And if you know anything about Plato, this is about as philosophical as you get. This is the work of art, what you're looking at right now. You have an actual chair, a photo of that chair, and then a definition of the chair, okay? And so he didn't make the chair, he didn't take the photo of the chair, and he didn't make the definition of the chair. These are just objects that he found or took a picture. And so you can see that he's dealing with kind of Platonic ideas of representation and mimesis. But again, unless you know something about Plato, Plato's theory of forms and all this, you'd never know what was going on here. And so when I see work like this, and a lot of the work that we've seen so far, I think basically what we have is a very simple and easy to make, but a profound category mistake. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that there are certain works of modern art that would actually be better categorized as works of philosophy. And if we do that, it actually makes them more interesting because we're going to be able to engage with them according to their most important or most prominent feature, which is meaning. And so I'm not saying that art can't be meaningful, but the point is that when meaning is not joined with craftsmanship and or beauty, then it's really hard to say, as far as I'm concerned, that this is a work of art. I think what we're looking at right now on the screen, it might be an interesting illustration of a philosophical idea of Platonism, but as a work of art, I really struggle to see it as a work of art because, again, craftsmanship and beauty is really hard to see here. So where is all this going, okay? Whatever art is, despite all the disagreements, I think most people can agree that one of the things art does is lift us up. In other words, it's good for us. It's good for society, okay? Art is a good thing, all right? Now, this is a contemporary work by a guy named Sylph Floyer called Ladder, okay? And obviously the rungs in the middle have been changed. But even though we all agree that art is a good thing, that it's supposed to lift us up, a lot of modern art has what I call an accessibility problem. And so if I were to take Sylph Floyer's Ladder and through the magic of Photoshop were to remove the rungs of the ladder around, we'd have something like this to explain what I mean by an accessibility problem. The experience of art and meaning are all up at the top, but there's no rungs down at the bottom because the rungs down at the bottom are typically beauty and craftsmanship. These are the things that give us access to a work of art. In other words, if you were just walking, ironically, this piece that you actually see on your screen right now, if you were just kind of walking through a warehouse and you saw this leaning up against the wall, you may never give it a second thought because there's no meaning or craftsmanship to it. And so you never engage it. You never have an experience of the artwork. Now, when I start talking about the accessibility problem, that we need to have more examples of meaning, we need to have more examples of beauty and craftsmanship, people will often accuse me of trying to make art too easy. And I just reject that kind of unequivocally, because number one, I don't think that art has to be easy to enjoy it. I think there are lots of examples of really difficult works that are hard to understand, but they, at least through their beauty and their craftsmanship, they give you a thread to pull. There are some crumbs to follow. And if you want, you can keep going. You can find out more about that artist. You can read the little museum tag off to the side. But without beauty and craftsmanship in any sort of way, the access point to the work is really hard to find. Again, unless you are somebody who has a PhD in art history, or maybe you come from a very wealthy, famous, powerful family who is around a lot of modern art, and maybe you would understand that, and so you can actually leap past the missing rungs of beauty and craftsmanship all the way to meaning. But regardless, I think not having meaning and not having beauty and craftsmanship represented is problematic. All right. One of the other things that Scruton talks a lot about in his documentary is kitsch and the sordid. And some of the images that I have represented down here at the bottom were pieces that Scruton talks about. There on the left, you have Tracey Emin's My Bed. You have Jeff Koons, his Michael Jackson and Bubbles. All right, are we good? All right, so one of the other things that Scruton talks a lot about in his documentary is kitsch and the sordid. And I thought this would be a good time to transition, because this process of dematerialization that I've been talking about, that sometimes manifests in art becoming like it's a fascination with nothingness, or a fascination with meaning, to the point that art actually becomes this form of dematerialized, like philosophy. There's another kind of nothingness in the terms of like absence or privation. And so this is what Scruton's getting about when he's talking about kitsch and the sordid. And you'll see some of the works that he actually talks about in his documentary represented below. We'll say a little bit about that here in just a little bit. So this is Tracey Emin's My Bed. This work was sold for $3 million in 2014. I won't say a whole lot about it since Scruton already talks about it, but essentially what this is this is actually her bed. She spent several uninterrupted days and weeks in this bed. There's all kinds of gross things all over the bed. And she just kind of transported it into a gallery. And now it's art, right? This is Jeff Koons, the king of kitsch. He doesn't see that as a derogatory term. He will actually embrace that. This is his sculpture, Michael Jackson and Bubbles. There were actually 3 copies of this made, and one sold in 2001 for $5.6 million. He's most known for his balloon dogs. This was at the time, it was the most expensive auction price paid for a work for a living artist, $58.4 million for this. And so this is where, again, Scruton says, like, I guess it's okay. Like, yeah, it's pretty, but it's sugary. It's like cotton candy or candy floss or whatever you call it in South Africa. I'm not sure. It's kitsch. It's just shiny. It's plastic. It's sugary. Kind of on the other side, on the sordid side, Scruton talks about this work by Piero Manzoni, where he canned his own excrement. Again, this is one of these tins was sold for $252,000 in recent years. I did want to give you guys a little bit of a warning. I'm going to show a few images that are a little disturbing or graphic, just so that you can kind of brace yourself. I promise I'm not going to show anything kind of pornographic or incredibly bad, but some of these things can be a little disturbing. This is a work called Seedbed by Vito Akanchi, and I want to preface this by saying that I'm not going out onto the internet and cherry picking weird, obscure works that nobody's heard about. These are, if you take a modern art history class, you will without a doubt hear about Vito Akanchi and his Seedbed work. The balloon dogs, Tracey Emin's bed. Like, these are not just on the outskirts of modern art. These are celebrities. But what you're actually looking at here, this is a gallery where Vito Akanchi made this ramp that goes up, and you can see a speaker in the corner, and then there's a woman over on the right-hand side walking around on top of the ramp. What you can't see in this photo is Vito Akanchi is actually underneath the ramp with his pants pulled down, and he's masturbating and saying sexually harassing things to the women who are walking on top of where he is through the speaker. He's telling what he's thinking about, what he's imagining that he would do with them. And all this is happening right underneath their feet. This is a work by Damien Hurst called 1,000 Years. In case you can't tell what's going on here, you have a severed cow's head with a bunch of flies that have been zapped when they hit the little bug zapper right above it, and they hit the ground, and there's a bunch of maggots over in this box. And it's just this kind of circle of life, if you will, of maggots turning into flies, hitting the zapper, and then falling down on the ground. This is a video work by Andrea Frazier. Again, I'm not going to show you the video for obvious reasons, but basically this is a sexual encounter that a collector paid $20,000 for. And according to Frazier, not for sex with her. Again, this is with the artist herself, but in order to make an artwork. And she says that she's asking the question of whether or not selling art to collectors is itself a form of prostitution. Interesting side note here is that Frazier is a professor and chair of the art department at UCLA. This is one of the most disgusting works of art that I've ever seen. This is by a guy named Santiago Sierra. Basically what you have here, he went out and found 4 prostitutes who were addicted to heroin. That's actually was very specific requirement here, because they were hired for the price. They were paid specifically the price of 1 shot of heroin, about $67, to give their consent to have their backs tattooed with a straight line. Again, that went across all 4 of them, as if to kind of negate their very personhood. They're not even single people. They're just one group of people that have this, again, random straight line that went across their back. Absolutely kind of heartbreaking. One of the more famous kind of celebrities in the art world when it comes to the sordid is Andrea Serrano, and his kind of most famous work is Piss Christ. What you're looking at here, he's a photographer. And what you're looking at here is a photograph of a crucifix that's submerged in a big vat of his own urine. And one of the reasons this kind of put him on the map was, yeah, it's gross, it's weird, it's sacrilegious. But one of the things that was the problem was this was part of an exhibition in the United States that was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. So in other words, my tax dollars and my grandparents' tax dollars. And so people got all up in arms about this one. But believe it or not, this was not the height of the sordidness of Serrano's work. This is a work where he photographed 66 large images of different kinds of animal feces. He even made his own contribution that he called self-portrait. I didn't show that one here because it's extra gross. He's got a series called The Morgue, where he actually went into a morgue, did not obtain permission from any of these families of the dead people that are represented, and took these kind of exquisitely beautiful but exquisitely kind of macabre images of these people. The titles are just a very kind of plain description of how they were killed. And these are just some of the other titles in the series. And I'll just kind of let that sink in for a little bit, that list. Every single time I show this slide, I have to kind of brace myself, because there was a time before I was a father where I would actually show some of these photographs to my grad students, but I can't do it anymore. Child Abuse 1 and Child Abuse 2 are actually of a child who was murdered by a father, and he takes a picture and kind of revels in their death, and doesn't even give them the dignity of it's not a redemptive kind of thing. Again, I'm not saying that art needs to be easy or rainbows and roses, but what Serrano is doing here is really a kick in the teeth. It's a punch in the gut. It's not a redemptive look at art. to show you kind of like where this guy's coming from, this is the actual homepage of his website. And he's got 28 different photo series that don't have anything to do with dead people or excrement or piss Christ or whatever. But this is the photo that he chose full screen for his website. And I just wonder, like, what does it say about a person when you have all of these different choices to kind of highlight what you do and what you're about? But this is what you put on the front, and you can go there. And again, I would highly recommend that you kind of think about or even pray about even going to his website. I've seen it, but I don't recommend it. But it's there if you want to go see it. So let's get back to Scruton, because that was one of the things I said I would do. This is really where Scruton is at his best, but I also think he's at his weakest. So Scruton does this incredible job of kind of highlighting all of these kind of sordid, crazy, ridiculous works of art that strain credulity. But as many insights as he has, his entire solution seems to be that we retreat to the classical past. We need more Michelangelo, we need more Bach, we need more Monet. Like, let's go back to the past. And he does very little to look to the future, or even look to now. Like, what's going on now that would actually exemplify the kind of work that he thinks is good and true and beautiful and excellent. And maybe even the question of, like, are there traditional artistic values that are being exercised today? And so as much as I love Why Beauty Matters, I think it's a missed opportunity, or it doesn't do all the work that I think it could have done. I think in general, Scruton, again, this is my critique of Scruton. Understand that I think Scruton does so much good, but this is my one critique of him. And I think in this video, he seems more interested in kind of giving some raw meat to his sympathizers, the people who are already kind of on the home team with him. And he doesn't seem very intent on building bridges or communicating with anybody. He's just kind of railing about modernity. But I'm a big believer that all truth is God's truth, and you affirm it wherever you find it. I'm guessing that Simon has probably talked to you guys from time to time about Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas is really good about this. He's not going to avoid a certain scholar just because they're Jewish or because they're Muslim. If they said something that's true, he's going to quote them as an authority. But he's also going to differ with them, and he's going to explain his arguments. And so, in the same way, I think we should call out the bad stuff whenever you see it, and whether that's in a museum or a church, you do that with grace and respect, and you try to engage the culture. But I think we have to be really careful about being dismissive of modern art. I think Scruton, and I don't say this lightly, because Scruton is he knows so much, and I can't even hold a candle to him in those regards. But I think he discredits himself with certain audiences, and needlessly makes this a traditional versus modern thing, and it doesn't have to be that way. I think he also risks, he obviously criticizes the art world elite, this kind of caste system that won't allow ordinary people like you and me to access works of art like this, or to comment on it, or to express our opinions on it. And I think he alienates these audience. But the biggest thing, and this is where I'm going to transition to a different kind of section in our talk today, and that's I think the biggest problem with Why Beauty Matters is he doesn't recognize this treasure trove of modern art and music that exists, that actually has traditional artistic values on full display. And so that's kind of what I would like to do next. So here's some modern examples. This is where I wish, if there was a Why Beauty Matters Part 2, this is what I would hope it would be like. So first of all, you don't have to look very far to see examples of beauty. Okay, so if you think about, and I choose this picture from Georgia O'Keeffe because it happened in 1918. This is 1 year after The Fountain, okay, with Marcel Duchamp. And so again, the whole triumphalistic narrative is that, well, once Duchamp comes on the scene, well, all bets are off and art goes off the rails and it's crazy and beauty's not important anymore. Well, Georgia O'Keeffe is actually working at the exact same time. In fact, Georgia O'Keeffe is married to Alfred Stieglitz, who is the guy who photographed The Fountain. That's the only fountain that the only photograph that we have was taken by Georgia O'Keeffe's husband, Alfred Stieglitz. So she's obviously she obviously values beauty. She's working at the same time. Kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of some of the work that we've seen, Norman Rockwell. He was scorned during his time. He's working in the 40s and 50s. This is at the height of Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. And so everybody thought that this was just kind of sappy, goody two-shoes kind of stuff. And it also didn't help him that he was doing this work for the cover of a magazine. He was the illustrator and painter for a magazine, really showing these works in art museums. But a lot of his editorial work actually commented on museum work. This is a great piece called The Connoisseur, and I love the restraint that he shows here. He doesn't just rail against Jackson Pollock and abstract art. Notice that he's got this person here, and you don't know if they're for or against what they're looking at. His posture is perfectly captured, where he's got a little bit of a lean, where he's contemplating what's going on. Is he sure? Is he sure what's going on? Is he not sure? We really don't know. But the craftsmanship's obviously there. The meaning's obviously there. And I think it's a work of art, and it's a work of art about art. This is another piece of his. Again, a common critique of like realistic types of art is that, well, why wouldn't I just take a picture of it? Because that's the whole triumphalistic narrative. Like once photography comes around, well, we don't need paintings anymore. We don't need representational paintings anymore. But that seems to ignore the reality that, like, does this look like a photograph? Well, sort of. I mean, it's representational. We can actually see things. There's a hat, there's a shoe, there's a flag, there's a boy, there's a soldier. But it's not as if it looks exactly like a photograph. There's sentimentality here. There's emotion here. There's a story here. There's meaning here. And again, this is somebody who was scorned by the modern art world at his time. He was also before his time. This is a work called The Problem We All Live With. And it's a kind of a depiction of little Rosie Bridges when she was being escorted by U.S. Marshals to the first school that was being integrated in the Deep South. This is a work by Andrew Wyeth. He's one of my favorites, called Christina's World. The craftsmanship here is undeniable. The meaning of this, you don't have to know anything about this artist or who this girl is, Christina, and you see the longing. There's a melancholy. There's you wonder what her story's about. But it pulls you in through the craftsmanship, through the beauty, and it makes you wonder about the meaning behind it. And you might learn about where this came from. This is actually a painting that he made of the girl much later when she was an older woman. He actually knew this family and interacted with this family. These are some of his other paintings. Some of his paintings were weird. They were kind of surrealistic. But again, you don't normally, when you're having a conversation about modern art or you're taking a modern art class, I've taken lots of modern art classes, but I've never had a modern art class that showed a single Andrew Wyeth painting, even though he's working at the exact same time as a lot of the big abstract expressionists and kind of abstract artists. Just a little bit of a plug here for a recommendation. I think this is either on Amazon Prime or Netflix, but this is a really great documentary on Andrew Wyeth that kind of talks about how Andrew Wyeth was this rebel, but he wasn't the kind of rebel that was just out there doing new stuff for the sake of it being new or weird. He was a rebel in his own day because he just did his own thing, even though it meant that he would kind of be ignored by the modern art establishment. And I thought this quote by Peter Kraft is exactly on point here. In an age of relativism, orthodoxy is often the only rebellion left. So here's some other things that normally don't come into the conversation. I think Banksy has a claim to what's going on in the art world that's actually very promising. His work is witty and fun and daring, and it requires a certain level of craftsmanship. He's asking big questions about what art is and what graffiti is and who owns it, and he's presenting it again in a very kind of sometimes comical way, but just sometimes a very witty way. Comments on society and like this love affair that we have with our phone. This is a video that was released last year. One of his paintings went up for auction, and he shredded it right as the gavel fell. So he paid millions of dollars for it, but there was a little shredding device embedded in the frame. And so before the person got to take it home, completely shredded. And so Banksy isn't just doing like interesting artwork, he's actually challenging this entire system that the art world is based on. These, you got to be a famous person, a powerful person, or have a lot of money to even enter the conversation. Banksy says, when you go to a museum, you are simply a tourist looking at the trophy cabinet of a few millionaires. There are other modern artists. Again, these are well-known modern artists, some of the ones I'm at least starting with now. Chuck Close did a lot of like hyper-realist work. This is a self-portrait that he did back in the 70s. This is the work that he does now. He's actually had a brain aneurysm, and it changed the way he works, but it's absolutely fascinating how he sees himself or sees the world now. And there's a lot of people I would call kind of up-and-comers, or people that you would never hear about if you go to the Museum of Modern Art or the London National Gallery, who are working in a number of different contexts, whether you're talking about street artists like Mona Caron, Alex Chenik, who's doing these really bizarre, very cool kind of installation art. Calvin Nichols, the kind of the epitome of craftsmanship. These little animals that he does are made from thousands of pieces of hand-trimmed pieces of paper. This is him at work, so you get a sense of like the scale that he's working at. But again, when we think about modern art, or when you hear somebody say, when you hear my grandpa say, I don't like all that modern art, well, he probably isn't even referring to this, but this is art that's happening now. Again, part of the problem is the word modern art is very confusing. It's not very specific. But this is absolutely gorgeous stuff, undeniable in its craftsmanship. But it doesn't just have to be representational. This is an artist from China named Ilhwa Kim. She's an abstract artist, but she works in these little rolled up pieces of paper, and she makes these big kind of mosaics from them. And again, they're completely non-representational. They're absolutely abstract. But when you look at it, you're absolutely fascinated. You're drawn in, you're pulled in by the beauty and the craftsmanship of it. I'm going to give you guys some resources to kind of look up some of these later. And but I think these are, again, this is the part 2. I wish Scruton would have said, but that doesn't mean you have to go back to Michelangelo. It doesn't mean that you have to go back to representation. Again, completely non-representation. I've given Simon a few pieces here that are about woodworking. We'll see here in a little bit. This is Robert Longhurst. Totally non-representational, but absolutely mind-blowing. What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything, but it's gorgeous, and it obviously took skill to make it. This is another artist that I highly recommend that you look for. He's got a great documentary that you can find on YouTube as well, named Andy Goldsworthy. This is a guy that goes out into the woods, out into nature, and he finds objects on the ground and he makes things and he photographs them and then he leaves and they disappear. To make this, he kind of scurried across the floor of a forest and found fall leaves of various different shades and placed them lovingly around the base of this tree to create this work. He didn't paint it. It's not airbrushed. It's not a Photoshop job. He did it with individual leaves. Same here. These are all leaves floating on the surface of water. More leaves placed in, again, this kind of gradient pattern. Rocks on a beach that he found of various different shades of gray. Again, completely abstract. The point is you can't say, well, Mark, you're just, you just want to go back a few centuries and you want everybody to be doing Sistine chapels. No, I don't. I think this is absolutely fascinating. And this is very, very modern work, but it's imbued with traditional artistic values. This is an artist named Hilary Fell. She takes leaves and she's a master with like a little X-Acto blade. The stuff that she's able to do. Again, what does this mean? It probably doesn't mean anything, but it's absolutely beautiful and its craftsmanship is on full display here. She actually sewed these leaves together with these tiny, tiny little threads. I'm hoping that on Zoom or on YouTube, whatever you're looking at right now, you can see some of the detail here and what she's done. It's absolutely mind-blowing. This is Susanna Bauer, who's also kind of working in a similar genre here. She does these kind of embroidered lace works joined with pieces of nature. This one's for Simon. This is a woodworking one. This guy is Brett Foxwell. I'll play this video for you. What you're seeing here is a time-lapse photography project with ends and cross-section. So you get to see these. Keep going and hopefully you guys can link to this later, but I want you to notice what Brett Foxwell says about this. The result is hauntingly beautiful imagery that's both abstract and unquestionably real. Again, you don't typically hear that kind of talk coming from the quote-unquote modern art world. It either has to be completely abstract or you're just a nobody like Andrew Wyeth who's just doing kind of photographic renderings. Again, I could go on and on and on. Alvaro Catalan's doing weaving, and he's working with indigenous people who are doing this and displaying this in the world's top museums. John Bisbee works with these big like railroad spikes, nails, creating something that looks like it came out of the Matrix or something. But again, completely abstract. But absolutely breathtaking. And even on the digital side of things, there's a lot to be worried about right now with all the whole NFT craze. There's also a lot of, like, the frontiers of art are just getting started. This is an exhibition that you can go to and interact with augmented reality on your phone, where you've got the actual physical artifacts on the ground, look at the lights, interact with people. again, this might not be your cup of tea, but again, it kind of proves the point that like there was so much more that I think Scruton could have talked about. Now, one of the things that Scruton does talk about is, again, the sordid, and he talks about tragedy and how there's a difference between the tragic and the sordid. So I wanted to spend a little time addressing this topic because I think, again, from a modern perspective, there's a lot of really interesting work here that needs to be kind of considered. So what I say here is, in order to lift us up, kind of going back to the idea of the ladder of meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty, in order to lift us up, sometimes art needs to take us on a necessary detour through the dark, the difficult, the bizarre, or the painful. So again, sometimes the accusation is like, well, Mark, you just want everything to be happy and beautiful and kind of cosmetic, and that's not what I'm saying. I don't have that kind of cosmetic view of beauty. This is a series of works by one of my favorite artists from England named Kate Maguire. She actually deals with her entire kind of MO is bringing together beauty and disgust. And what she does is she takes serpentine figures and bird feathers and puts them into these beautiful like serpentine shapes, but you're kind of repulsed by it on one hand, but then you're also drawn to it at the same time. It's kind of like watching Planet Earth or Discovery Channel when you're watching the great white that's chomping down on the seal. You're kind of appalled, but at the same time, you're like, wow, this is awesome. How did she do this? And again, craftsmanship and beauty on full display. Again, art can be weird. This is a lady named Nancy Fouts who just does these kind of, again, witty, weird kind of combinations, these forced connections, where she just takes things and kind of puts them in different contexts. And they're, again, imbued with meaning. Going back to, again, Andrew Wyeth, this is a painting that's, I think, very instructive. Like, this is not a pretty painting. I think it's beautiful, but it's not, again, it's not rainbows and roses. Like, again, there's a depression here. There's a melancholy here. There's a longing here that that isn't just fully captured by the words pretty. Okay. In the world of music, this is a famous song performed by Billie Holiday, but I wanted to play just, I wanted to play it for you. It's very short, just so you can kind of get a sense for what she's talking about, which is a very, very difficult subject, but she's doing it in the context of a beautiful song.
Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar tree.
In case you don't know who Billie Holiday is or know about this song, she's basically talking about what it was like to be an African American in the U.S. at this time in the early 1900s, and she's singing this. It's a beautiful song, but what she's actually singing about are lynchings that are happening, and the strange fruit that she's talking about are bodies that are burning and hanging from trees. So you have this, again, this strange mix of the beautiful and the ugly, but it's not sordid. It's not the same thing as Serrano's work or Santiago's work. The topic is redeemed by the beauty. Even in the contemporary sense of music, Trent Reznor from the Nine Inch Nails, he writes this song called "Hurt," where he's talking about pain and drug use, and it was actually covered by Johnny Cash. And again, these songs are heart-wrenching, but they're at the same time, you don't avoid them. They're not a punch in the gut. They're not a kick in the teeth. They're works of art. And this is true across all genres of music. Blues, jazz, country, they all express these difficult realities of the human experience, but they do it in a redemptive kind of way. Same thing on the classical side. There are songs that will break your heart, but you want more of it. There's an interesting story told by Lucian of Samosata. He talks about this bronze bull that was made by a guy named Perillus and given to a king named Phalareus. And it was a big hollow bronze bull, and it had a door on the side, and in the nostrils of the bull, there were these reed instruments called alloy. And what happened is that they put people inside of it. It was a torture device. They put people inside of it, and they put it over a fire. And again, this is a somewhat fictional story. And so the idea is that when people inside the bull would begin to scream out in terror and pain, what came out of the bull's nose was actually music that was actually nice to hear. And Kierkegaard actually refers to this story and describes the poet as someone who conceals profound anguish in his heart, but his lips are so formed that the sighs and cries pass over them like beautiful music. And so the idea here is that a lot of times we benefit from the artist's pain, and we want more. We're kind of caught in this catch-22 of like, without the artist's pain, we aren't blessed with their artwork. Again, there's lots of examples here. Again, I mentioned Hieronymus Bosch earlier, doing these kind of visions of hell, again, that again aren't necessarily pretty, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who said that this kind of work isn't art. It doesn't qualify just because it's not beautiful, or because, again, it's not pretty. I think these are examples of what I would call terrible beauty or horrific beauty. This is I'm only going to show a quick slide of this. Computer animated sequence on. It's absolutely, but you can't walk away from it. So very prioritize beauty. You don't a beauty that's difficult reality. I'm a big horror movie fan. Not all horror movies, but one of my favorites is Pan's Labyrinth. This is a scene where the main character comes face to face with kind of this monster, one of the best movie monsters I've ever seen. I'm not going to play the whole thing for you, but it's a great example, again, of craftsmanship and this kind of dark kind of beauty. But it's a redemptive beauty because it's, at the end, you actually learn something about yourself or about the way the world works. This is a photographer that's known for, again, his very, very difficult subject matters, but he keeps them in beautiful form as a way of kind of highlighting what's going on in the world, whether it's famines or ecological disasters. Another photographer who works in this same genre is Edward Burtynsky, who, again, takes beautiful pictures of ecological disasters. And again, it just shows you the scale of some of these things. This is a a big tire depository, used tire depository. This is a photo called Falling Man, and it's from September 11th. And again, I think this is again a really striking image. Like the artistry is undeniable, but it's also tragic. It's difficult to even look at. But the point is that there are certain works that have a way of redeeming any type of ugliness that it captures, because it's not in the service of evil or lies or the merely sordid. Whereas, again, works like Andre Serrano's stuff, because they're in service of the grotesque or the perverse, it's really not even right to call it beauty. It's a kind of a pseudo beauty. It's corrupted by this. So, just as a little recap of where we've been, all right. So we've got meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty, and I think that, again, that's the trifecta, that all three of these things come together to create art. But one of the things that I argue in my dissertation is that we need a little bit more flexibility than this, because I think there are examples of art that they only have two of those things. And so I would also extend the idea of art to things that only have two of the three. But if things that only have one, that kind of goes back to what I was saying with, when you just have meaning, you end up with some type of art as philosophy. If it's just craft, well, you're talking about maybe the difference between carpentry and woodwork. Somebody who can frame a house versus somebody who can carve a magnificent dining room table. And then beauty by itself is just something, again, that wasn't made. It doesn't really have a meaning to it. It's just a beautiful thing. So something maybe like a sunset. And I'm getting right here to kind of tie everything up. It was like, I see parallels here. So why am I giving this talk to Ratio Christi? Well, I see really interesting parallels when it comes to issues that do affect our faith. And primarily this comes from this tradition of the transcendentals, this truth, goodness, and beauty, where all three of these come together. They're all constituents of reality. And so if I were to kind of bring us back to the illustration that I made earlier, you'll see these parallels. And this is for a project for another day. But I see very, very interesting parallels between truth, goodness, and beauty, and meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty. I'll kind of close with this. This is an excerpt from Solzhenitsyn's Nobel Prize lecture. And if you haven't read this, I highly recommend it. Solzhenitsyn's probably best known for his Gulag Archipelago, which I'm actually working through right now. But this is his lecture from 1970. He says, and I'm going to read this for you. He says, "One day Dostoevsky threw out the enigmatic remark, 'Beauty will save the world.' What sort of statement is that? For a long time, I considered it mere words. How could that be possible? When in bloodthirsty history did beauty ever save anyone from anything? Ennobled, yes, or uplifted, yes, but whom has it saved? There is, however, something special in the essence of beauty, a special quality in art. The conviction carried by a genuine work of art is absolute and subdues even a resistant heart. A political speech, hasty newspaper comment, a social program, a philosophical system can, as far as appearances are concerned, be built smoothly in consistency on an error or a lie, and what is concealed and distorted will not be immediately clear. But then to counteract it comes another contradictory speech, commentary, program, or differently constructed philosophy. And again, everything seems graceful and again hangs together. That is why they inspire trust and distrust. There is no point asserting and reasserting what the heart cannot believe. But a work of art contains its verification in itself. Artificial, strained concepts do not withstand the test of being turned into images. They fall to pieces, turn out to be sickly and pale. They convince no one. Works which draw on truth and present it to us in live and concentrated form grip us, compellingly involve us, and no one ever, not even ages since, will come forth to refute them. So perhaps the ancient trinity of truth, goodness, and beauty is not simply a dressed up, faded formula as we thought in the days of our self-confident materialistic youth. The crowns of these three trees converge as the scholars have maintained, but the two obvious, two straight stems of truth and goodness are crushed down, cut down, or not allowed to grow. Then perhaps it's the whimsical, unpredictable, unexpected branches of beauty that will push through and soar to that very same place, and in so doing will fulfill the work of all three. In that case, perhaps Dostoevsky's remark, "Beauty will save the world," was not a careless phrase, but a prophecy. William W.H. Auden contrasts this. He has a completely different point of view. He's a poet. He says, "I know that all the verse I wrote, all the positions I took in the 30s did not save a single Jew. Those attitudes, those writings only help oneself." And so I'm using this to kind of contrast Solzhenitsyn and Auden's kind of optimism versus a pessimistic view. Again, Solzhenitsyn has every reason to be pessimistic. He spent time in a Russian gulag. But he still has this optimism about beauty has the possibility to save the world, not in some kind of utopian kind of sense, but in the little ways. Art and beauty have a way of kind of saving the world, whereas Auden, unfortunately, seems to look at the negative things that are happening around him and thinks like, what can art do? What can beauty do to make an impact on this sort of thing? How are we doing on time, Simon? I don't want to keep you guys. Should we get to the Q&A?
No, you can finish off, wrap it up on this. I'd like to hear this. You're doing well. No worries.
Oh.
We're in African time. Yeah.
So I want to real quickly kind of take you through like what are the transcendentals? What are these? What is this truth, goodness, beauty? This ancient trinity that Solzhenitsyn talks about. Okay. Now there are other transcendentals, but these are the ones that we're going to spend the most time talking about. So in general, this is Transcendentals 101 through a fire hose really quick. So truth is what appeals to your mind. Okay. Again, these are all constituents of reality. And so because it appeals to the mind, it is worthy. Something that is true is worthy to be believed. Okay. Goodness, that's what appeals to your will. And so that is what is worthy of desire or choice. Okay. You want that. You need that. Okay. Now, beauty, again, this is that whimsical one. It's the weird one, right? It appeals to the heart, the feelings, the emotions, the imagination. And so that's what makes it kind of tricky. And so that which being perceived pleases you, and it's worthy of admiration. Okay, so all three of these aspects of reality are really important. These are 4 U's that I kind of came up with to try to help, like, again, just give you a mnemonic to kind of remember what makes the transcendentals special. They're universal, okay? So the transcendentals apply to everything that exists. And again, that might seem a little weird at first because what about all the bad things in the world? Well, there's an answer to that. So they're called transcendentals because they transcend all categories, not because they're weird or new age or something like that. It's because they're part of all things. There's some type of aspect, but even bad things, evil things, the thing that makes them bad, the thing that makes them evil, it's most of the time it's because you can actually pinpoint, well, it's because they lack in beauty or they lack in truth or they lack in goodness. Some examples of this. So let's take the most extreme example, maybe murder. Okay, so it's neither true, good, or beautiful. But notice that when somebody is murdered and you're watching the news and they're telling it, they don't just give you the facts. They don't just say someone was murdered or that it's not good that somebody was murdered. Like, because murder is kind of obviously not good because it ends a life. There's an ugliness to the act of murder. And so if we only describe the act of murder in its kind of factual sense, or in its that a life was ended sense, then there's a whole aspect of the ugliness of this act that we miss out. And so this is a good illustration of how the privation or the absence of the transcendentals also kind of apply to its universality. They're also ultimate, okay? We pursue them for their own sake. In other words, if somebody says, why should I believe X? Well, because X is true. Why should I want X? Well, because X is good. Why should I look at or listen to or experience X? Well, because X is beautiful. And if somebody wants more argument here, there's really not much more you can say. Like, what do you say to somebody who says, well, why should I want what's good for me? Because it's good. Well, why should I want to believe what's true? Well, because it's true, because it's beautiful. Like, so this is what I mean by their ultimate, that you pursue them for their own sake. In other words, we can't, and they're also unlimited, okay? We can't get enough of the transcendentals. We pursue them without end. Like, we don't say, oh, that's enough goodness, or that's enough beauty. I think I've had enough. C.S. Lewis says this really well in The Weight of Glory. We do not want to merely see beauty. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become a part of it. And just so you know that I'm not just coming at you from a Christian standpoint, I want to share a quote from Camus. He says, beauty is unbearable. It drives us to despair, offering us for a minute the glimpse of an eternity that we should like to stretch out over the whole of time. So obviously Camus and C.S. Lewis are coming at this again, maybe from a pessimistic and optimistic kind of view. But even Camus recognizes that beauty has this kind of eternal or unlimited quality to it. And I think we could extend that also to kind of truth and goodness. The last kind of U here is that they're unified. They're convertible. They all kind of describe each other. They're defined by each other. So beauty is truth, truth, beauty. This is all you need to know on earth and all you need to know by John Keats. So what do I mean by that? Oops, where did I miss one here? Glaser talks about, Milton Glaser is a famous graphic designer who actually recently passed away, and he was a big collector of African art, and he talks a lot about how that in certain African cultures that they didn't have, there's no original word for art, but interestingly, there is a common word for beauty. And that is something that, again, kind of jibes with this idea of the transcendentals being unified, because it's also a similar word for their idea of good. And if you actually go back to ancient Greece, it was the same sort of thing. The good and the beautiful were often used interchangeably to describe certain situations. And so this is what I was saying earlier. All three are defined by each other. Truth is both good and beautiful. Goodness is both beautiful and true. Beauty is both true and good. Okay, so you have this trinity. Okay, if you want to use like Trinitarian theology to kind of even sort this out, there is an order, right? There is a hierarchy. It doesn't mean that one's better than the other or more powerful than the other, but there is an order that goes truth, goodness, beauty, truth at the top. But we typically access these things or discover these things in reverse order. Again, you don't notice your spouse for the first time across the room because of their character. You notice the beautiful person across the room, then you notice how good they are for you, and then you notice their character. But again, beauty can be treacherous because it's the most, it can even be sinister because, again, when it's divorced from truth and goodness, it can be misused, it can be perverted. Dostoevsky again says the awful thing is that beauty is mysterious as well as terrible. God and the devil are fighting there, and the battlefield is the heart of man. Examples of this, all right, the catchy song with the debased message, right? Like you love the song, but when you actually listen to what it says, like, oh, it kind of puts you in a quandary. Being attracted to a person's physical appearance, even though you know they're not good for you. They're not the type of person you should be with or pursue a relationship with. I think pornography is probably the best example here, where there is a sort of a type of good of sexual pleasure and a type of beauty, but because it's divorced from the truth that this person is not a piece of meat, that they're a subject and not a mere object, well, it's not true goodness and it's not true beauty. It's a pseudo beauty and a pseudo goodness. Or even if we think about the Third Reich, this is a book that I highly recommend that I read a few years ago, Hitler and the Power of Aesthetics by Friedrich Spatz. This is a photograph of one of his big rallies where, and what you notice in the back, it was a big spectacle. Hitler was intent on making it an aesthetic experience. And in fact, the book that I've got over here on the left, it actually makes the argument that the Third Reich was not a war machine. It wasn't a political movement. It was actually an artistic movement. It was an aesthetic movement. If you know anything about Hitler, he actually was a failed artist. But these rallies, he actually took all of his anti-aircraft lighting, which was super important in the middle of the war, and he used it to light these big rallies to increase the drama and increase the spectacle of it. So last few things here, I promise I'm wrapping up. The thing you got to make sure you understand is that when I'm talking about beauty, I'm not talking about a surface level cosmetic thing, kind of like Shakespeare's talking about here, this here today, gone tomorrow, a vain thing, a gloss on things. It's something more substantial than that. Beauty is not, and it's more than just mere aesthetics. Von Balthasar also says, our situation today shows that beauty demands for itself at least as much courage and decision as do truth and goodness, and she will not allow herself to be separated and banned from her two sisters without taking them along with herself in an act of mysterious vengeance. And so Balthasar is giving this haunting warning that when you divorce the transcendentals from each other, you get these perverted pseudo goods, pseudo beauty, pseudo truth, pseudo good, and we have to be careful of that. So what does all this lofty philosophical stuff have to do with the real world? Well, I think Scruton was onto something when he spent so much time talking about architecture. This is a house, if you've ever taken an art history class designed by Lord Corbusier, he is famous for saying a house is a machine to be lived in, okay? And this comes straight from Louis Sullivan, who coined the term form follows function. If you've ever been to Paris, these are a couple of just kind of quintessential neighborhoods, Le Marais, Montmartre. And when people think of Paris, this is kind of what they think about. But this is actually Corbusier's plan for Paris. If you notice, this is actually where Notre Dame is, and this is where Le Marais is. He wanted to completely bulldoze the whole thing and build these huge concrete monstrosities. And it was because it was connected to political issues. You can put armies and tanks and even planes on these. You can quell rebellions. He even actually references Paul of Tarsus and the early Christians, how one of the reasons that Christianity took off and caught like wildfire is because they were embedded in these little houses that were all on top of each other. Well, if you don't want that to happen, if you want to keep revolution from happening, this is the way you need to build your city, because you can go in and you can get rid of people really fast like this. Scruton says, beauty puts the brakes on destruction. And I think this is another example of this. This is a housing project that was built around the same time in St. Louis. It only lasted 18 years because it was built like a prison. And so there was so much crime and poverty and bad things that happened in this government housing project that they completely tore it down, even though it was a multi-million-dollar establishment. Wouter van Tessveld is somebody that I'm just going to kind of reference you guys. Check him out on YouTube. He's an architectural scholar from the Netherlands, and he does this incredible study about these riots that happened across France in 2005. And they all happened in these post-war concrete style project buildings. And he's asking the question, obviously there's a lot of complex variables that's, in play, culture and poverty and hunger and all these sorts of things. But when he does this study, this wave of riots that happened, he found that they all happened in they started in all these kind of similar types of architecture. And so he asked the question of like, he proposes the idea that this is an example of how aesthetics actually changes our behavior and changes our culture and changes public policy. And so I'd highly recommend it. So these are just a few takeaways to close with. I'd leave you with, number one, your view of art is connected to a lot of different things: your ethics, your faith, friendship, public policy, just generally how the world works. You got to have a philosophy of art if you're going to engage the culture. Okay, and so this is one of the reasons I'm giving this talk to Ratio Christie. You're also going to run into people that the logical arguments, the rational arguments, they're not going to go very far. And then what are you going to do? And part of this is we have to stop being so dismissive, and we got to look for some common ground and actually engage with the culture. You can't weaponize Michelangelo and Bach because it's ineffective and it's distasteful. A couple of recommendations: Roger Scruton's book on beauty, Don Thompson's book on the contemporary art world from an economic standpoint. And then I would also recommend this website. This is Colossal. If you guys are just looking for a source for contemporary art and design and craft that you won't necessarily see at the MoMA or the National Gallery. These are places that you can go. I appreciate you guys sticking with me. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Simon knows also how to get a hold of me. But with that, I will stop sharing and just entertain any questions that you guys have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was awesome. There's so much there. I'm having the same experience that I had when I watched Scruton. At the end of it, there's so much in there. I felt like I've been drinking from a fire hydrant. But that was awesome. We're going to have to insist that you come to Africa and come and spend some time, and we can take a longer time to walk through all of these things. That would be awesome. We actually got a number of questions have rolled in, so let's just dive straight into it. The first one is, just as a clarification, are the four elements you mentioned, beauty, craftsmanship, meaning, and representation, part of the essence of good art? Are there other things to take into consideration? So are those four things logically exhaustive?
Good question. The only one that I wouldn't put in the central kind of trio is representation. I think it's clear that work doesn't have to, I think you can have abstract art that doesn't represent anything, and it can truly be art. That's why some of the contemporary examples, so many of the contemporary examples that I showed were completely abstract, non-representational. That doesn't mean that I think representational, the trick here though, and the reason Danto ends up rejecting representation and he ends up rejecting craftsmanship also. He rejects it because he rejects representation. And you can see how craftsmanship goes by the wayside, because once you get rid of representation, you don't really need craftsmanship so much anymore, because, well, if your drawing of the vase of flowers doesn't look like it, then it doesn't matter anymore. So craftsmanship and representation are kind of tied together. And again, that's also where photography came in. When now all I have to do is click my camera, I don't need any craftsmanship to capture that. So that's when abstract art takes off. So yeah, for me, it's meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty. And I would say that you have to have 2 out of the 3 bare minimum. And I think truly great works of art have all 3, or they have 2 at extremely high levels. So for example, you take Bach's cello suites. They're just instrumental, beautiful cello chamber music. There's no meaning to them necessarily, but the craftsmanship and the beauty are working at such a high level that they're genius, they're masterpieces. So that's what I mean by the 2 out of the 3.
Okay. there was a slide. They said, please talk us through the slide before you start with examples of good modern art. Title was something like Christians care about art. There was one slide there which you.
Yeah. That was actually a mistake that there was just all the stuff that I had there at the end, all the little takeaways.
Okay.
So sorry about that.
No
That's why I flipped over it real fast.
Okay. Your next one, yeah. What is the difference between pornography and nude art? Kind of like Michelangelo's David.
Yeah, great question. That's something that I had to deal with quite a bit as an art student in my undergraduate experience because I had to take figure drawing, and I think it's. I might try to draw a parallel, kind of like with the difference between like Serrano's work that dealt with obviously like very difficult subjects, and then some of the really beautiful work that we dealt with that was also beautiful, but it wasn't just a sordid kind of thing. And so pornography is something that presents it's lacking in truth, right? It's giving you a pseudo beauty and a pseudo goodness. There's sexual pleasure, which is a good, and then there's beauty with the beautiful form, the woman or the man who's represented in the pornography. But because it's not joined with truth, that's what makes it pornography. And so what do I mean by it's not joined with truth or it's divorced from truth? Well, the truth is that we are subjects, that we are made in the image of God, that we're rational beings. And whenever pornography will typically portray somebody as an object, as a thing to be lusted after, not to be engaged with or to have a conversation with. And so is there a fine line sometimes? Is there a spectrum? Oh yeah. I think it's really hard. There are some like obvious examples of pornography, and then there are some, again, your Michelangelos of the world, where you look at it and you go, well, that's not causing me to stumble. That's not causing me to lust. It gets a little tricky somewhere towards the middle, but I think the good thing about truth, goodness, and beauty, but also meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty, they act as kind of a rubric to help you sort out those difficulties. When you see something that you're just not real sure about, like what to make of it, I would encourage you to think about, well, how would that filter through truth and goodness and beauty, meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty, and let that kind of guide you on that. But I think I'd start with anything that presents somebody as an object rather than a subject. That's a lie.
Yeah. I think Scruton in his documentary talks a bit about this with the Platonic view of love, and he references a lot of it around that piece of artwork done by the Italian, I forget now, that did that picture of that beautiful young woman. You actually had it at the bottom of one of your slides there.
Botticelli's Venus.
Yes, and I could see in that piece of artwork that tension between wanting to spare yourself from lusting after this beautiful girl, or actually just acknowledging that she's beautiful. So you see that what that picture does as well is it kind of demands of me to constantly check myself. It's an interesting piece of work there.
I think it also, the part of that question depends on the person, and I don't say that lightly as some kind of relativist, but like there are certain things. When I was a teenage boy, the Sears catalog that came to my house, there were certain pages that would have got me in a tizzy over it, just whereas later on in my life, after you kind of become desensitized to certain things, it doesn't do the same thing for you. Or in my case, I've taken a lot of figure drawing classes in my undergraduate experience, and so there are some works of art that feature nudity that wouldn't do anything to me. But each person has a different kind of threshold for those sorts of things. I mean, Scripture talks about this, about to whom it is sin, those sorts of things. And so you have to guard yourself, but at the same time, I do think there is a sense in which we want to make sure we're not sheltered or. And man, what a tricky thing, especially when you're talking about children and raising your kids. Like when do you start introducing them to things? Because you don't want them to grow up and be desensitized, but you also don't want them to be kind of goody two shoes. You want to preserve their innocence, but you want them to be able to engage the culture. So it's a tricky question.
for sure, for sure. Next question then, well, kind of what you ended off is tying into the next question. How can Christians use beauty in the arts to reach people with the gospel?
Yeah, I think number one, I think it's just one more part of culture that that you can find common ground with people. Like, people often say like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I think that's a there's some truth to that, right? There's like some subjectivity. We have different tastes, but I actually believe that if you look at the vast array of different artworks and things that we find beautiful in the world, sunsets and bird patterns and trees and all that, we actually agree on far more than we actually disagree. It's only those the minority that we disagree on. So I think just starting with, hey, here's one more piece of common ground that we can meet at and talk about. I think that's a good thing. I think Christians sometimes have, because they have this kind of bad reputation of being kind of goody two shoes, they're automatically discounted as somebody who's you've already removed yourself from the culture, and to some degrees, I think this critique is true of some of the church. Like, we've created our own music companies and our own artistic movements and our own movie companies, and a lot of them are really bad. Not all of them, but I think showing that we can engage with good work, make good work, there's a legitimacy, a cultural legitimacy that you develop, and so you're able to talk about other cultural issues, whether it's social issues, sin issues, religious issues. But if they see you as a prude or somebody who's completely disconnected, you've never listened to music that's not church music, or never looked at art that wasn't on the ceiling of a cathedral, I think there's a credibility problem. And then more theologically, I would say, like, that's partly why I kind of belabored, or I know we were going towards the end, but I really wanted to get to truth, goodness, and beauty, the transcendentals, because that Trinitarian kind of quality to it is also true of God himself. Like, he's good and he's true and he's beautiful. And I think too often the church focuses on, again, is God true? Absolutely. Is he good? Absolutely. But we forget that he's also beautiful, that he's, and I again, when we look at Christ, the example that Christ lived, he's the embodiment of those three things. He turns tables over in the temple, but he also lifts the head of the woman caught in the act of adultery. And so I think this is having that kind of fully orbed understanding of art and letting it spill over into the way we interact with people and our ethics and our public policy. I think those are all reasons why Christians should not discount the arts as just this kind of extracurricular thing.
Okay. Since you mentioned it there was another question, was how would you respond to the statement, beauty is in the eye of the beholder? What would you have said to Tracy Emin if you were interviewing her, like, and scrutinizing when he asks her, and she says also, why is this beautiful? She says, because I say so. Like, kind of like,
art because I say so.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, like, that doesn't go very far, because, like, when you look at if we were to extend this to the realm of ethics, some crime or some tragedy, well, it's good because I say so. Or if somebody makes a piece of racist art or sexist art, what's to stop me from saying, no, that's not sexist, that's not racist, it's wonderful, we need more of this. And so I think that's a really kind of a thoughtless, easy kind of thing to say. But there are certainly people who say that. There are certainly people who believe it to a certain extent, but that's really hard to live out it's hard to be consistent on, because I guarantee you, if you get Tracy Inman in a room and you start pushing her a little bit on like, well, what about this piece of art that I didn't show it, but there's a group, a collective of women artists named the Guerrilla Girls. They're a group of feminists who would agree with Tracy Emin on a number of things, but they one of their things is they point out the sexism and racism among the art world, and I would think that Tracy Inman would say, "Way to go, Guerrilla Girls! That's good, and that's a good thing that you're doing." And if some, male came along and said, "No, I think we should subject women. I think we should kick the women out of the museum. I think the only thing we should have on the walls of the museum are naked women," I think she's going to have a problem with that. So that kind of hardcore relativism just doesn't really hold much water, I think. And now, is there a certain level of subjectivity when it comes to art? Certainly. Their taste plays a role in it. Scruton is a big, he's Kantian to a certain extent, and taste plays a major role in Kant's aesthetics. There's certain types of art that are not really my cup of tea. I probably showed you guys lots of work tonight that while you look at it, you go like, okay, I can see how that's got craftsmanship and beauty and meaning, but like that's not really something that I like. I sometimes relate this to beer. I'm not a big beer fan or wine fan even. I understand how people do appreciate it and talk about, oh, this wine has legs and this one has this hints of this and hints of that. That's all kind of lost on me. Now, if it's barbecue, totally different. We can have that conversation. But I have a feeling it's like that in art. Taste does play a role in it, but I would never be so kind of pig-headed to say like, well, wine's just disgusting. I don't see how anybody could ever say those things about it just because it doesn't appeal to my taste. But that also doesn't mean that if somebody tried to tell me that they picked up a big cow pie, and I don't know what you guys call that in South Africa, but I'm trying to be
yes.
Nice here, and somebody said, "Oh, this is excellent. This is one," and like, just because there's some subjectivity plays some role in it doesn't mean it's merely subjective or merely relativistic. So
yeah,
that would be my best shot at answering that question, I think.
No, that's fine, because I think that so then my question would be then, because it seems to me at some of this it feels like there's actually at the beginning of Scruton's thing there's this woman with glasses on, and she says, I think they're making fun of us.
Yes.
Do you think it's legitimate to say some of the stuff that's gone on in the art scene is just a bunch of con men? You kind of, once you get into the elite artists, that these guys literally are making fun of us and, painting a piece of canvas with house paint because your mate did it. And then somebody's throwing, $250,000 at your sordid bed. And you go, well, gee whiz, I'll keep this going up because this is a nice way to live your life. And just basically take the trash out of my house, move it into the Tate Gallery, call it something. And if the art world approves of it, then hey, I mean, is that what Duchamp is trying to do, is to kind of mock that whole thing? I mean, Banksy seems to be doing that kind of thing as well.
There are definitely lots of con men in the art world, and some of them have kind of drank the Kool-Aid so much that it doesn't, they're sincere, but they're just sincerely deluded. But it's full of con men. I think there are some that are absolutely true. Like, I don't think Duchamp is a con man. I think he actually is trying to say something. Again, it's not my favorite artwork, and I don't think his ready-mades are artwork, and that's a talk for another day. But yeah, there is a problem with there's a hierarchy of art world institutionalists and then all the regular people like us down here that are not able to or are not allowed to comment or to inform what goes on. We're not even allowed to question. We're expected to kind of file into the museum and cower before the work of modern art and say, well, I guess I just don't know very much. The woman that you mentioned from the Scruton documentary, I actually have her in my slides right before I quit. She says, it's just a pile of bricks. I think they're making fun of us. And I use her in my graduate classes as kind of this person that we always refer back to, is the lady who says this, because we've all felt that. Like, well, who am I to say? But she actually expresses it, and she has every right to. And at the very beginning of my dissertation, I make the point that, like, that lady is actually more modern than most moderns are, because modern art has a tradition of questioning tradition. Every single modern art movement was born because they said, you know, I don't think the people who did it that way were right. I think we should do it this way. And so for anybody to tell us or to imply to us that we should just accept it, and that if you don't get it, you just don't know enough, well, that's not very consistent with the kind of rebellious nature of modern art movement. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to learn and try to expand our horizons and expand our tastes and learn more about modern art, but that doesn't mean that you have to like it afterwards either. So I talk a lot about, in other places, I talk about this accessibility issue. There's a physical inaccessibility of the artwork, which is that it's based on kind of cultural issues and economic issues. And then there's this inaccessibility of the meaning, the latter idea. But those are definitely factors that affect all of what we're talking about.
No, cool. Well, like I said, there's so much to say. Yeah, we're gonna have to hear you again on these things, and as I said, even better if you can come to. So maybe we'll close with this last question then, and it's probably a good one to ask, because here in Potchefstroom we have a number of church buildings, and some of them are beautiful, and some of them not quite so beautiful. And I remember we talked about this at SCS. Speaking of chapels and cathedrals, should Christians, and in brackets here, especially Protestants, be concerned with the aesthetics of church buildings? So this part of Roger Scruton's documentary is great when he talks about the architecture, because having been involved in construction and built some structures myself, I kind of had a first-hand experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes, we should be concerned about it. The other side of that, the contextual part of that is, all the big Gothic cathedrals were built, 1,000 years after the church started off in home churches. So we have to have some perspective on this. I think, yeah, it's a balance, right? You work with what you have, and you try to leave room for, or kind of save up for things in the line of improving the interior of your building or exterior of your building or your building project. But yeah, does everybody have to attend church at a cathedral? No, I don't think that's realistic. I think the problem is really more of the attitude, or the kind of the posture that Christians have, where they never give any thought to it, or they think it's not important. That's really the problem, because that will manifest itself in other ways, not just in the building. That will manifest itself in your evangelism, because again, if you just treat people like they're people to be convinced instead of persuaded and loved and befriended, then you're not treating them as a full person, as a fully rounded human being. And so, yeah, like if you're at a church that has the kind of resources to treat your building or your grounds in a way that makes it something that inspires worship, or enhances worship, by all means you should do that. But you also have to take it in balance with your ministries to the poor, and the culture in which you live. And that just takes wisdom. This is where Aristotle is very helpful. It's there's flexibility, but that flexibility doesn't mean you're a relativist. There's a prudence, there's a wisdom with the resources that you have. So yeah, you just have to use prudence and make sure that I think you do always need to ask that question whenever you've got some new venture, whether it's evangelistic or building project or theological or whatever. Again, I think these truth, goodness, and beauty, meaning, craftsmanship, and beauty, these are rubrics that will help you kind of ask yourself, is there something we're missing here? And but yeah, that's a sore spot for a lot of Christians, not just their buildings, but like the way they do their music, the way they do the interior of their service, you name it. So.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. I really appreciate it. And we're going to end on that note then. And so, like again, on behalf of Raja Christian, thank you for your time. And we'd like to certainly interview you again on these issues. And so we'll be in touch. If you can just hold on for a sec now as we wrap up with the tech, because there's a bit of a delay now. And then I can introduce you to some of the students via the digital world. So if we can just hold out for the wrap up, that's great. Thanks very much.